So we are in a new sermon series, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, and it is entitled The Questions That Jesus Asked. The Questions That Jesus Asked. So, here we go. Questions Jesus asked. Some amazing questions that Jesus asked. And we're going to look at those in a moment. I trained to be a secondary school teacher in 1999 in London in a place called the Institute of Education. And in our first lecture, our first seminar, quite about the same number of we are here, stacks of wannabe teachers. And the lecturer at the front asked the first question, what makes a good teacher? Get into threes, they said, and talk amongst yourselves. And so we talked about all the things that makes a good teacher, and I'm sure you guys have got your own ideas as to what makes a good teacher. And then we sort of shouted back to the lecturer, and then they wrote it on the board, standard teaching stuff. And we came up with a really great list, and I'm sure we could all here come up with a really great list of love the subject, love the people that you're teaching, all those sorts of things. But we missed out one, and the lecturer said, oh, you missed out one. And we're like, really? And it was the best teachers ask the best questions. Yeah, sorry, I sounded like a teacher then, didn't I? The best teachers ask the best questions. And I've always stuck in my mind, and I know from my many lessons teaching secondary schools for just under 20 years, the lessons that went really well were the ones I actually took time to think of the questions I want to ask. Because it's questions that draw out response. Questions open up a conversation. Questions are the starting point of exploration and depth. Whereas answers are the sort of full stop, aren't they? So here are some questions that Jesus asked. He asked these, do you love me? We're going to be looking at today. And here are some others over the next few weeks. Why do you worry? Has no one condemned you? Who do you say I am? Why are you so afraid? What's going to be interesting? Where is my father? And where is my mother? Where it's not Darth Vader. Where is my mother and brother? Why are you weeping? What should I do for you? Jesus asked a lot of questions. Does anybody know? Put your hand up if you know how many questions Jesus asks in the Gospels. That's not a great teaching question, isn't it? Because it puts the teacher in a place of great power. I know because I looked it up on the internet, okay? Anyone know? It's 307 questions. Amazing, 307. And he is asked 183 questions. And how many answers did he give to those 183 questions? Under 10 of them, which is quite interesting. Jesus was in the business of asking questions, not always giving the easy answer. And it's why Alpha is so wonderful, so successful, because it is a model of inquiry and finding out about Jesus through questions, through asking questions. Incidentally, today is the last day that we can sign up for Alpha, which is taking place on Wednesday evening. So please do that if you want to ask some more questions. Why did Jesus ask so many questions? Why did he? I mean, some of it's part of the rabbinic tradition. He was a rabbi, and that was very much the tradition of the day, as it is in the traditions of many other philosophies and religions. Asking questions revealed your mastery of the topic, revealed your mastery of what you were hoping to explore and teach with your followers. And so, yes, questions instigate relationship. They open the door rather than close the door that answers might do. And Jesus is wanting connection, but he's also wanting his followers to think deeply. He wants his followers to respond deeply. He wants us to be ponderous. I like that word, ponder. Those of us with beards can ponder. I think he wants us to think deeply. One of my kids, when I was driving them from primary school, I think one of them was about 8, I can't say the name, and they're sitting there talking about their maths and really enjoying maths. And I remember him saying, which is a complete mystery to me, by the way, but he's saying, he says, I think I'm doing really well in maths, Daddy. I make him sound really precocious. He's not like that at all. I think I'm doing really well in maths, Daddy. Hopefully by the end of the year, I'll be working at greater depth. I'm like, I'd never heard this expression before, but if you've been around primary schools, you'll know that working at greater depth is kind of exceeding the level that you're at, okay? I think that it's an attainment. I'm looking at Dawn. Yeah, it's an attainment level, working at greater depth. And I've been thinking this phrase over the last couple of days. You know, I want to live at greater depth. I want to love at greater depth. And Jesus calls us into that greater depth in our lives. So in some ways, the questions that Jesus asks invites a depth response, invites us to enter into greater depth in relationship with him and our understanding of the kingdom of God. So hopefully over the next 8 weeks or so, we will, all of us, take those tentative steps into the greater depth that Jesus is calling us into as he asks these questions. And there must have been plenty of times where the followers of Jesus would have got really frustrated, in the same way that when I was teaching in 2003, I was teaching in Hong Kong. Some of you may know from Hong Kong. And I was teaching a class, and we're coming to the end of a piece of curriculum, coming to the end of the year, and there was quite a lot to get through, teaching a Shakespeare text. And one of the kids, quite a precocious, clever kid, put his hand up because I was asking a lot of questions, to sort of tease out understanding. And he said, look, we haven't got a lot of time for this, sir. Can you just tell us the answers? And we'll remember them, and we will write them down in the exam. And I said, well, it's not really what we do as English teachers. That's what they do in maths, but okay. So I gave them all the answers. No, we want the quick answers, don't we? We want the answers. Give us the quick answers rather than the deep questions. But Jesus does the opposite. He asks the deep questions and calls us into deep thinking about things, calls us into pondering about things, which takes time. And in our culture, we skit across the surface of stuff. The internet world has created a quite superficial. We skit across the surface of information. We want just give us some bullet points. And Jesus invites us into the depths, to think deeply, respond deeply, connect deeply with things. So that's sort of where I'm going to go over the next 20 minutes. Great. So our first question, our first invitation into the depth that Jesus calls us and all of us to. And this question, 4 words, this question moves Peter gently into greater depth in his relationship to Jesus. It calls him into a greater depth of understanding of Peter's own purpose and his calling. It calls Peter into an understanding of his name, Peter, the rock upon which I will establish my church. Are you ready for that depth, Peter? Greater depth in his experience of God's grace and forgiveness, of Jesus' forgiveness. Are you ready for that depth, Peter? Calls Peter into greater intimacy with Jesus. Depth. Do you love me? Do you love me? Have you ever asked that of someone? Do you love me? Has anyone asked that of you? Do you love me? Would anyone like to come up and tell us about it? No way. That is a personal question. It is deeply intimate question, a private moment, isn't it? Sometimes we say those words maybe once or twice in our lives sometimes, or maybe not at all, but Jesus says, do you love me? And invites Peter into this intimate, precious, tender moment of connection. And for us to really understand the question that Jesus asked, we need to remember. We need to remember the context. And John, the gospel writer, wants us as readers to remember what has come on before. What happened in John 13? John is reminding his readers. What happened in John 13 is Peter, when talking to Jesus in front of all the others, says, I will never forsake you. I will never run away from you. I will go to prison for you. I may even lay down my life for you, Jesus. He says that in John chapter 13. And then we jump a little bit ahead and we remember what happens in John chapter 18. Do we all remember it? Jesus has been imprisoned and he is on his way for execution. And what does Peter do? John focuses on that little moment, little time where Peter is around a charcoal fire, which is an interesting detail given what Jeff has just read. And what happens around that charcoal fire is Peter denies Jesus. Not just once, but not just twice, but 3 times. He denies that he even knew him or was a follower of Jesus. And so fast forward to John chapter 21, the disciples have returned fishing. They have seen the resurrected Christ twice already. But they return fishing. Perhaps they return to the things that they understand and knew. Who knows why they went back fishing? And the resurrected Jesus appears for the 3rd time and invites them onto the beach for breakfast, as Jeff read. And so we're going to ask some questions from this little text. The first question is, well, what does Peter do? I want us to look a little bit at Peter here. How does he respond to this invitation? Now, the first verse that I want to look at is verse 7, because it says here they're on the boat, and it says, as soon as Peter heard him, that's John, saying, it is the Lord. So as soon as Peter hears that it's Jesus, what does Peter do? He rushes. He does what Peter always does in the Gospels, that he doesn't think, and he rushes into doing what he needs to do. And in this case, he wrapped his outer garment round him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. I was kind of thinking about this, like, this is a strange thing to do. I'm sure the scholars will know why he wrapped his outer garment around. He'd obviously taken it off to go fishing, but he puts his clothes on to get into the water, which I find a little bit strange. It's the equivalent of, yes, I'm coming, I'm going to swim to you, I'm coming, keep the charcoals warm, but I'm just going to put my coat on before I swim. It's not quite like that. Suggests that perhaps the water was shallower than we thought, and he wades back to the shore. But I want us to think about, what might Peter be holding in his heart? What might he be pondering in his heart as he's spending a 3rd time with this resurrected Jesus? What might that be? Of course, it must be that feeling of guilt and shame that he denied the very person that he had committed to following, even unto death. And he couldn't even say that he knew him. He must have been holding on to that guilt. He must have been holding on to that wound, if you like, in his heart. But I'm interested that Peter doesn't bring it up, does he? And I wonder why. I was asking that of the passage of the story. Why doesn't Peter bring it up? You know, he's the first out. He rushes to Jesus. So it's obviously just Jesus and him. And, you know, he could have gone, Jesus, I really need to talk to you about something, but he doesn't. He does what we all do, really, is that we hide it. Yeah? He's sort of, you know, the phrase, brushing it under the carpet, except he's on a beach. He sort of brushes it under the sand, if you like, or the elephant in the room, the elephant on the beach. You know, are we going to talk about the elephant? No, let's just pretend and let's just crack on. We're having a barbecue. Everyone have some beers. Come on, join us. I can just see Peter enjoying and pretending and hiding from that elephant in the room, which is his greatest failure, his denial. But the smell of the burning charcoal, who knows, may have made him think a little bit about the last time I smelt that smell. John chapter 18, I denied Jesus 3 times. So I find it really interesting that whilst he leaps out of the boat towards Jesus, he wants intimacy with Jesus, he wants connection with him, but at the same time there is a little tug of resistance in him as well. Doesn't bring up his failure. He doesn't bring up his denial. And I was thinking, I recognize, and I wonder whether you do as well, I recognize the push and pull of our connection with God, the push and pull of intimacy. You know, we all want intimacy with one another. We all want intimacy with God, with Jesus, don't we? And yet, whilst we might rush towards it, there is also something in us that holds back a little bit, that resists a little bit. And I wonder what that is for you, because I know, even in my own really close relationships, whilst what am I trying to say is I think God has more for us in our relationships. And we have to overcome that reticence, that holding back, which Peter displays in this moment. The push and pull in our own lives. So I've got a couple of questions for us to ponder, little tricky questions that will hopefully lead us into greater depth for the primary school teachers amongst you. So what stops me? What stops me? I'd love you to ask this question and notice your response to the question as well, because that's interesting. What stops me from being vulnerable with others? And how might I grow in this area in my relationships? Because vulnerability is the key. Peter doesn't dare go near that really vulnerable place, but Jesus does. So what stops me from being vulnerable? What stops me from deepening my relationships with others, and thereby deepening my relationship with Christ? And the second one is, which area of my life am I reluctant to share with my friends, my family, my spouse? Is there an area of your life that you have brushed under the carpet sand? Is there an elephant that you are ignoring, just as Peter is ignoring it? So questions that lead us into greater depth. So we've asked what Peter does. We're now going to ask, what does Jesus do? What does he do? The first thing is he establishes connection again. Clearly, Peter's sin has disconnected him from Christ. He doesn't have the connection with Jesus. And it is Jesus who instigates and Jesus who reestablishes that connection. And he gently, and I love this, he gently points out the elephant on the beach, to mix my metaphors. He gently points it out. And I was thinking in this, I was asking, is this during the barbecue? Is this while all the other disciples are there? And are they all sitting there going, you know, what Jesus says, do you love me? Are they all going, awkward? No. Because I noticed a little bit later on in verse 20, it says, we're told that John was following them, which suggests that Jesus and Peter, after the meal, are going for a walk. Some of the best chats, and maybe you've experienced that, some of the best chats with people are side by side on a walk or going for a drive. And it's in that moment, and Jesus is so kind, he's so gentle, he's so tender, he's so loving for Peter, that he takes him away from his colleagues, from his friends, to have that difficult conversation. My wife Sarah is a counsellor, and or a therapist, and she's been doing it for a couple of years now, well, a few years now. And I was asking her recently, so what's the key? What's the key, you know, when you're sitting there and you're wanting to help someone? And she said this, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, but I've passed it by her. And she said, yeah, it's pretty much what I think. She said, I try to ask questions in a gentle, non-judgmental, empathic way that help my clients move towards their pain, towards the things that they're avoiding. And I was like, that's so interesting. In that moment, in this moment here, Peter does exactly that. Sorry, Jesus shows us how to counsel, how to be with people. He gently uses a question that draws Peter to that place of pain. Not to shame him, not to make him feel bad, but to bring it into the light. To bring it into the light. He's effectively lifting up the carpet and he's going, Peter, we need to talk about this. Oh, do we? Can we just pretend it never happened? We need to talk about this. Because Peter, you're not gonna fulfill the calling that I have for you in your ministry unless we deal with this. I find that really interesting that Jesus does that. And so, as Sam already alluded to, he asks 3 times. Now, I'm not going to go into the agapes and the philies. All sorts of people say different things about this. But I think the important thing is that he asks him 3 times. Do you love me? Yes, of course. You know that I love you. Do you love me? You know that I love you. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Why does he ask 3 times? I'm not even going to answer that because we do know. John chapter 18. Jesus gives him that opportunity to bring it into the light, and in doing so, healed Peter's heart in an extraordinary way, where he is restored, healed, and forgiven. So, another couple of questions to help us live and love in greater depth. Is there something in my life that I need Jesus' forgiveness? Is there someone in my life that I need to forgive? Another question. Which area of my life still needs God's healing? I think this is an important question. Can you name that? I'm not going to get you to say it out loud, but maybe this week, write it down. These are the areas that I know in my life I need God's healing. Because our capacity to live the life of depth, the life of Christ, the life that God has for us, to live deeply, is connected to our capacity to deal with those things in our hearts and lives. And we need to talk about them. We need to deal with them. A few more minutes. Isn't it strange that there is a connection between our capacity to have an intimate relationship with God, to be connected to him in some way, and our capacity to have good, deep relationships with other people? They sort of go together. It's strange, but it's true. Think of the people that you know who have a really wonderful prayer life, and you know that they are deeply connected to God in some way. And chances are they will be able to replicate that intimacy with other people, and vice versa. I don't know. I don't really understand why that is the case, but it is. Perhaps we can all think about it this week. What are the questions that you know that people need to ask you? I've got a friend of mine who I'm in a little Thai group, or a group of 3, who I've known for years and years and years. And when the first meeting that we had years ago, a friend of mine called Ted, he said, okay, these are the questions I need you to ask me every now and again. And they were to do with, well, I'm not even going to say what they were to do with, but they were questions that went deep. You know, we skit across the surface. Let's stop doing that. Let's resist that. And let's find relationships, connections in our life groups and in our families, where we actually dare to, not to everyone, because we have to be discerning with this, where we dare to go a little bit deeper. Because that's the call. That's the call. So, a few more minutes. You're doing really well. So he connects, he reestablishes that connection with Peter. And then finally, last point, he commissions. He commissions him. Isn't it interesting that in that moment of restoration, the relationship is restored, that Jesus commissions Peter into something far greater, far deeper than Peter would ever have imagined. Feed my sheep, take care of my sheep, feed my lambs. The good shepherd tells Peter to be a great shepherd. I love this. He hands to Peter the most precious thing, which is his sheep. Jesus hands his sheep to Peter, commissions him, giving him a purpose, giving him a commission. So Peter's connection and intimacy with Jesus, his purpose flows out of that connection. And it's the same with us. A few more minutes. Last summer, we were praying a bit about our pastoral ministry in the life of the church. And as we were praying, some of us had a picture of a swimming pool. And it was a big Lido. And St. Michael's Church was kind of a big Lido, with the focal point was the water, was the pool. But all sorts of activities, and it was right on the edge of the ocean, right on the edge of the sea. And people were coming in and out from the ocean, from the sea into the Lido. And we were all around the Lido in different life groups and different ways of expressions of church. But the water was, as we understood it, was the expression of our life in God. And we're all of us invited to into the life in God, into the water, into the deep water. As we were praying earlier this month in January, I've got a real sense that God is inviting us all into the deeper things of God. I mean, what that looks like, I'm not sure, but that is the invitation to us all. And that for many of us, and I know this for myself, I like being in the shallows because that's safe. I've got my feet on the ground. But the invitation for all of us in our life in Christ is to move a little bit deeper. I remember when I learned how to swim, I have a strong memory of well, we were all learning to swim, and I'm swimming beautifully on the surface, but I'm walking on the bottom with my legs. I have a really strong memory of that, because I wanted to pretend to the teacher, oh, I'm doing this so well, but I was just walking. And I remember him saying, you need to just lift your legs up. But I might drown. Do you trust me? Do you trust me? And I think that is the invitation for us for this year, is all of us are being invited into the deeper things of God, deeper relationships, deeper marriages. What does it look like? What does it look like to have greater depth in our generosity, greater depth in our worship, greater depth in our engagement with mission, greater depth in our friendships, because that is the call for all of us, that we might move out into the deeper water. And the beautiful thing is, just bear with me here, is that Jesus doesn't make us. He doesn't throw us into the deep end. It's a gentle invitation. Come, I've got more things for you, Peter. I've got more things for you. You know, some of us here been Christians for decades, and did you know that God has more for you? Some of you here, you've been married for decades, and the fact is that Jesus has more for you in your marriage. Some of you have been friends with various people for decades, and Jesus is saying, I've got deeper things for you even in these relationships. There is more, and it is a place of joy. Isn't that great? It's a place of joy. I'm going to ask the band to come up, if that's all right, Rachel. Do come on up. Came across this little tweet. Says this: there's nothing like depth to make us dissatisfied with superficial, shallow things. Once we've delved below the surface and tasted of the marvels and mysteries of the deep, we realize the value of plumbing those depths. What are the depths that God is calling you to plumb in this season? In relationships, in your prayer life, in your reading of scripture, in your worship, in your generosity? Where are the areas that God is calling us to deepen, to deepen?